welcome back to Holiday Horror. This is episode 6. I messed that up in the last video. I said episode 6 in the last video, but this is considered episode 6. And in this episode, I wanted to talk about not a movie, but a particular episode of a television show, and that is the Twilight Zone. And a couple years ago, I did like my top 10 favorite Twilight Zone episodes with some honorable mentions. Now, in that video, I did not mention this particular episode, but this is one episode that I really like to watch around the holiday season, and that is the episode called Night of the Meek. And I wouldn't necessarily count this as something horrific or actually holiday horror. Twilight Zone does have some horrific things, horrific sci-fi plots and such, but this is one of the more kind episodes, I would say. But this is one I felt that I really wanted to review and talk about because it's one that I really enjoy. And if you've never heard of this episode or seen it, it's pretty much about a guy named Henry who is a department store Santa Claus, and he pretty much wants to just spread the joy of Christmas and just see people be happy, and he wants to be a big gift giver and see people not really suffer who deal with poverty or are low income. And with this episode, when you're first introduced to Henry, he's just kind of at this bar. He's pretty loaded, so you think, okay, this guy is just a drunk and a lowlife. But as the episode goes on, he goes back to the department store where he works as the Santa Claus, and he embarrasses himself because he's really drunk, and a lot of people notice that he is drunk, and his boss is yelling at him and everything. And it ends up to him having this big speech with his boss and other people witnessing, because obviously he embarrassed himself, so everyone's looking at him like, what's going on with him? And he pretty much says that, he's like, as far as my intoxication, I have no excuse, that's inexcusable, but I was not rude to this little boy. Like, the mom forces him to go up to Santa, and even though he was intoxicated, he was very friendly with them. And he ends up basically getting really honest with his boss and says, I have a hard time expressing emotions, so it's at a point where I could either drink, which is a lot more subtle, or I can weep, because he says every Christmas I see nothing but the only thing that comes down the chimney is basically more poverty, and I just see these people suffer and really don't get anything that they need just to get by. And he said, I just wish that there was a night that the meek could could run everything, or have a night for themselves. And so he ends up going off, and most of this episode is that beginning process of him just being yelled at, and him just dealing with a lot of hardships, and he's not really welcome. Like, he tries to go back to the bar he was just at after he gets fired from the department store, and they don't want anything to do with him. The bartender's like, get out of here. And most of this episode, the beginning is kind of depressing, I would say, but the rest of the episode has a lot of hope to it. And I liked this aspect of the Twilight Zone where it's like, you could take a premise like this where people who just don't really have much for themselves and aren't really getting much for the holiday season, kids who aren't getting toys or things they want, you can kind of spin that and say, this guy can help provide that. So the rest of the episode, Henry ends up stumbling upon this big bag, and it's just full of stuff. Anything he thinks of, he can give out to people. And it kind of causes some controversy, this sister from this church who's just singing and playing the organ, and at this Christmas Eve service, Henry runs in and has the big bag, and he gives everything that people wish for, he's able to give to them. And a police officer comes and basically he's like, come down to the station with me, because he's like, you don't have a receipt for all these things. And he ends up calling, his former boss that he just, fired him, and comes down and he's like, he's just like, I hope he gets 10 years or whatever. And I like the fact that it's just, even the people who don't believe him, he's able to provide something with, his former boss asked for like a bottle of brandy, and Henry is just like, he's like, I wish for a bottle of cherry brandy 1903 or something like that. And I love Henry's just like, well, that was a good year. And he puts his bag up on the counter, he pulls it out. And so this is just, overall, I really like this episode, and one of the few like Twilight Zone episodes that has, a nice ending. And you could tell with Rod Serling, who wrote a lot of the episodes and, was pretty much the creator of the show, the narrator, you could tell that he had a lot of love for Christmas writing this episode. And that's something that I really appreciated. And the fact that's like, even with a show like the Twilight Zone, where a lot of horrific things and terrible things can happen, you took this premise and, you really gave a spotlight on those who, almost becoming like, a voice for the voiceless in a way. And I really liked that aspect. And with Henry's speech, like at the beginning of the episode, when he's intoxicated, he says a lot of things that are, still hold true to this day, I think, where he is just talking about how materialistic the holiday can be. And it's just, Christmas should be full of compassion, charity, and love, and not just, like barging and roaming down department stores and, yelling at people and everything. And obviously that holds true to this day. People really lose their minds over trying to get a certain item, or, not getting a certain deal. And it's just, you shouldn't be focused on that type of stuff. And it's like, it's not trying to preach that necessarily, because he just basically says it's like, this holiday should be just full of love, and people should be more kind and everything. And that's definitely what the message at Christmas is, at least to me, is just being more charitable, being more kind to others, and being more understanding. And that's something that I really liked about this episode, and that's kind of a good reminder. And especially just being able to provide something that, for the people who can't really get those things and are less fortunate, are able to, it gives a spotlight on them in this episode. And the character of Henry is kind of, the physical like metaphor for that. And yeah, I mean, this is an episode that I think people should watch, around the holiday season, especially if you have seen, episodes of the Twilight Zone and you are a fan of this show and you haven't seen this episode. I definitely suggest checking it out. Some people may watch this episode and there are aspects of it that do feel a little dated, at least the way it's filmed and certain scenes are executed. You could probably say that. At least I have noticed that, but there's enough for me that I can look way past that. And with the Twilight Zone in general, it's like, there's a reason people still talk about this show to this day, because the episodes are still so good and still reign true as far as, symbolism and messages with everything going on, nowadays. And a lot of these episodes, can still, really strike a chord with people. And it's funny that even though they have rebooted the show years later and try to, redo certain episodes and such, it's like people just still go back to the original, and I don't think they ended up remaking this episode, at least not to my knowledge. But this is one you could tell that Rod Serling had a lot of love for, and had a lot of love for the holiday of Christmas. And I really liked his little narration at the end. They did, like, a funny fact is they did add him saying, "And a Merry Christmas to all" at the very end of the episode. I think that was added later, like maybe years later. But the version I watched, I've seen both versions, and at the end the narration usually at the end of his little speech, he does say, "There's nothing mightier than the meek." And like it ends there. And then there's a version that they added later, and I think this is the version that most people have seen, but he says, "There's nothing mightier than the meek, and a Merry Christmas to all." And you can tell that that was added much later because the audio really switches, like the type of recording, and it's definitely something that's very noticeable. And that's not a bad thing, you know, for them to add that, because it's not like it doesn't seem like that's the way that he would have just ended it there. And, you know, with this being, you know, pretty much the Christmas episode of the Twilight Zone, I can understand them adding "and a Merry Christmas to all." But I love that phrase of "there's nothing mightier than the meek." And, you know, that's the reason this episode is called that. So, that's pretty much all I have to say about this episode. But, you know, this is an episode I highly recommend everyone check out if you have liked any episode of the Twilight Zone, and, you know, it's the holiday season. Check it out, because this is one of the more sentimental, happy endings to a Twilight Zone episode. And, you know, most Christmas movies and television shows and television specials usually give you some sort of glimmer of hope and, you know, kind of gives you a happy feeling at the end of it. And this is an episode that will do that. So definitely check out the episode Night of the Meek from the Twilight Zone. And I'm going to wrap it up there for this episode of Holiday Horror. I hope you all enjoyed. Give me a thumbs up and let me know if you've seen this episode, what you think of it, and if, you know, there's other TV show episodes that you have seen that you think I should check out. You should definitely let me know. I might do one on the Tales from the Crypt Christmas episode called "And All Through the House." So depending how much time I have left for this holiday season, I may do that, I may not. Let's see. But I hope you all have enjoyed, and I will see you in a future video. Bye.